Hello, this is a short tutorial video on the topic of backup. The catchphrase for today is continuity of service is mission critical, which means that if you don't have a recovery plan and your service is backed up, then your business can potentially go very, very wrong. The learning objectives, by the end of this tutorial, I'd like you to be able to define the term backup and be able to also describe a strategy for a specific business study. So when you refer to a backup, it's important that you note that you're making a copy of the data and programs in the system, and then you're not just transferring them to another location, and that there is both data and programs being backed up. This can be used to restore the system if data becomes lost or corrupted. A backup strategy is a document that should really contain how often the system will be backed up and what data will be backed up each time, which media will be used, and where the data will eventually be stored. By the term media, I mean things like hard disk drives, optical discs and magnetic tape. So how often will it be backed up? Well, the first question you really need to ask when you're backing up a system is, should you back it up continuously, as in constantly making a copy of your data as it's being used, or are you going to do it as a scheduled task, either overnight or monthly or weekly? Each of these options denotes actually how important the data is to your database, because all the data that's changed after the backup is taken will be lost if the system crashes. So things like programs, for example, aren't that important, and you can always reinstall them at a later date. Files, on the other hand, will generally be backed up overnight, and a database, which is probably seen as the most mission critical part of the system, it may contain orders of products that people want to buy, or details in a school about who's in detention and so forth. And these need to be backed up continuously, and there's a particular method for doing that. It's known as mirroring. You have two options. You have a redundant array of independent drives. This effectively has multiple hard drives that have the same copies of data on the different drives. And the other option that you've got for larger services is to use a separate server off-site. Now, a server is a computer that's a shared resource of other computers. And so, for example, you might have a web server which will contain a range of web pages, and a site like Facebook would mirror that data between multiple servers. The key thing to consider when you're thinking about how often, whether it's going to be continuous or scheduled, is how much data can you afford to lose, and how important is that data. The next question will be, what data will be backed up? So given that you're not going to be doing it continuously and backing up all your data, on a scheduled task, you've got some options. You can either choose to back up the whole system. Now this can take a long time to do. You think about a school where everybody had a gigabyte of data and there's 1,000 people in the school, it's going to be about a terabyte of data, so it can take a long time. The other option, however, is not to back up the whole system, but actually to back up changes in the system. Within a system, we're quite fortunate that we will have a thing called a transaction log, which on the network it records all of the files that have been saved or edited or deleted, and just the names of them over time. Now, a differential backup will save all of the files, will back up all the files that have changed since the last full backup, whereas an incremental backup is done in smaller steps, so that it will save all of the files that are listed in the transaction log since the last incremental backup. Now that has real implications when it comes to the restoration speed. So as the incremental backup is backing up the least data, because it's only backing up the difference since the last incremental backup, it's the fastest. However, each individual incremental step needs to be restored, and therefore it's the slowest. I'll demonstrate this now. So if you had a differential backup, you'd make a backup process maybe on Monday. Tuesday you would compare the data in the current system to the last full backup, that's Monday's, and record all the files, make a backup of all the files that have changed. Wednesday you'd compare back to Monday's file and make a differential backup of that, recording everything that's changed since Monday. Thursday you would record everything that's changed since Monday. Friday you record everything that's changed since Monday. And then in order to restore, you would just restore Monday's full backup and then look at the Friday differential file, which contains all the files that have changed since Monday, and restore that. So it's a two-step restore process. However, each time you're having to back up more and more data because more and more files will change since the original full backup. An incremental backup, on the other hand, requires you to make a full backup on Monday. Tuesday, you might make an incremental backup of all the changes since Monday. Wednesday, you'll make an incremental backup of all the changes that have happened since Tuesday. Thursday, you'll back up all the files that have changed since Wednesday, and Friday you'll back up all the files that have changed since Thursday. But then, in order to restore the whole process, you'll need to restore Monday's full backup, and then the changes that are made on Tuesday, then the changes that are made on Wednesday, then the changes that are made on Thursday, then the changes that are made on Friday. This naturally is a very slow process. The core thing that you need to consider when choosing whether you're going to do incremental, differential, or a full backup is actually how quickly do you want the system to restore versus how much time are you willing to spend backing up each day, and how much space do you have to store the backups. Which media will you use? Well, you'll be familiar from this earlier in the course. You've got various options. You've got magnetic tapes. These have got quite a large storage capacity, and they're very cheap per sort of megabyte. The core disadvantage is their sequential access. If you remember a video cassette disc, before we had DVDs, that you'd have to rewind and fast forward, and they work in a similar manner to this, and therefore you can't quickly access files. So if somebody comes to you and says, I've lost a file, you'd have to scroll through the whole tape in order to find it. Hard disks have a middling to large capacity, they've got really fast access speed, you can access any specific file. The disadvantage is they've got movable parts, and so potentially can get damaged a little bit easier. Optical discs are small. They've per megabyte, they've got the lowest cost, and they're also they've got the lowest total cost, which means for the machinery and the disc they're very, very cheap. Again, they've got direct access, but they've got a small capacity. The last option is basically to outsource the service and to use a remote backup service. So you'd store the data, your backup, on the server off-site. You can get a separate company to do this, and you'll have to pay them. The key disadvantage is it requires a high connection speed, and that might mean that it takes a while to restore your system because you have to download it off the remote backup service first. Key factors, there's a range of factors, but access speed is in how quickly can the device get read to and written to, what are the costs of the individual devices, and what are their capacities based on what you need to back up. Where will the data be stored? Well, these aren't either or options. You can use any of a range of them. You could either use, you should use a fireproof safe to ensure that it's protected from natural disasters. Store it in a different building is required, so it needs to be away from the original system. You could do that via a remote server, or you could do that even just by a technician's home and take a set of tapes away in a locked briefcase and store them with them. The key factor to consider here is how secure does your data need to be. Leaving it in someone's personal abode might be a little bit insecure, and also continuity of service. How quickly can you get that data back from the place that it's stored to the place where it needs to be, and is that going to lead to extra downtime on your website or system? And so looking at the things that you need to do to make a backup strategy, first of all you need to consider what data, as in whether you will want to do a differential backup or an incremental backup or a full backup. Prior to doing that, you need to look at how often. Will it need to be continuous and using mirrored systems such as RAID or a remote server which is mirrored, which media you're going to use, hard disks, optical disks, remote backup server, or magnetic tape, and then finally which location will the data actually be stored at. So those are the things that you need to think about before making a backup strategy. Thanks very much for watching the video, and I hope you can make use of the other videos in the channel.